Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Blue Bench Podcast. My name is Gabby Crevitt. I'm the Communications Director of the Montana Democratic Party. Today on the show, we have Jason Boeshore. Jason is a proud member of the Board of Directors with MDP. He's the chair of Richland County Democrats, and he's a grain elevator operator in Culbertson. Jason, thanks for being on the show today.
My pleasure.
So let's just jump right in. I know the topic of the day for you is usually tariffs. But before we jump into all that, do you mind first giving our listeners a little background about yourself and what you do in your professional background?
So yeah, I got started in commercial agriculture in early 2013, around February. And this is that, I started working in commercial agriculture after a fairly long career in the military. I was mostly in the National Guard, but did a little bit of everything. In my previous life, I was a military intelligence officer, and I'm also an OEF veteran. So I had a long combat deployment in Eastern Afghanistan and decided for a change of pace after I got back. So that's kind of where I got started in commercial agriculture. And I really cut my teeth in the industry mostly as a merchandiser slash trader. And my career has evolved. I've kind of done a little bit of everything at this point, from, like I said, merchandising, trading, origination, farm marketing, and now I'm in operations. So now I manage a grain elevator from the operational standpoint, even though I'm still the principal grain buyer and principal grain marketer for the facility. So basically what that means is if a farmer wants to sell their grain, I'm the guy who buys it, and I'm also the guy who tries to help them achieve the best possible price using marketing strategies, whether that's buying and selling options, using the futures market, or using exotic contracts. So farmers really like having a person who can help them navigate that pretty complicated task of marketing their grain. So that's kind of, like I said, what I'm doing now in Eastern Montana.
Okay. Well, great. Sounds like you're definitely going to be an expert on this topic. So, my first question for you is how have tariffs changed the kinds of conversations you're having with local farmers?
Well, how tariffs have changed the conversation, the most direct way that tariffs have affected the Eastern Montana farmer is in the cost of their goods, obviously. Because out here, in Richland County and Roosevelt County, like for example, when these farmers go to purchase parts for their implements, like there's a very popular implement dealer out here called Brandt, and those machines are made in Canada, and all of the parts are in Canada. So, and obviously the Canadians have kind of gone cold. Obviously the farmers can still go across the border and they can purchase these materials, but there's a lot of anxiety about what that's going to look like in the future. Another more immediate one is fertilizer. So as everyone knows, modern commercial agriculture requires chemical fertilization plan, and a lot of those fertilizers, specifically potash, comes directly from Canada. And we're only about 2.5, 3 hours south of Regina over here. And so a lot of guys, that's the direct pipeline for their fertilization plan. Obviously we do have agronomists out here, but the cost of everything has just gone up because it was just much easier to get it directly from the Canadians than it is to get it from, say, the US Midwest, which is much further away for us. So, it's like every other business. Freight is going to gobble up all your margins. So the further away something is that you need to purchase, the more it's going to cost. And now with all the hijinks at the border, things have gotten complicated for these guys looking into the future.
Okay. So you're touching on this already, but can you walk us through what happens to a bushel of grain here in Montana and how tariffs are disrupting that chain?
Yeah, I would love to do that. So in Montana, we export nearly all the grain that we grow here. My expertise is wheat. So just nationally, most of the wheat crop in this country goes to export, but in Montana, it's something around 80%. Because obviously we produce more wheat in this state than we can conceivably consume. So almost all of it gets shipped, mostly to Southeast Asia. So we're talking about like Malaysia, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, Indonesia, places like that. So it needs to go to a port. So it needs to travel on the railroad, mostly to the ports in the Pacific Northwest. So right now, we still have pretty friendly relationships with those countries. So the real pain point is what's going to happen in the future because of the, frankly, schizophrenic implementation of these tariffs coming out of the current administration. There's just a lot of question marks of what's going to happen in the future. So this has created kind of a weird situation where we simply don't know who's going to be our reliable buyers in the future, because right now countries are starting to think about what their plan is going to look like if it doesn't include the United States, because we provide the bushel for the quality buyers. The United States wheat bushel is still one of the most expensive in the world, if not the most expensive. So we depend on these developing nations and developed nations in Southeast Asia because frankly, they're the only ones that can afford to buy our products. So like if we're talking about extremely price sensitive buyers, like for example, Egypt, who most years is the number one wheat buyer in the world, like I said, they're very price sensitive and we simply can't compete. Like I said, freight gobbles up your margins. We're the farthest away. So most of their grain needs are met either by France or from the Black Sea market or other local providers. So because of the expense it takes to get the higher quality US bushel to that market. And even now, what was it, 10 days ago, I believe Reuters reported that the Canada and Mexico both got together and are coming up with kind of their own NAFTA style plan that doesn't include us. So it's become quite scary because if you think about our neighbors to the north and south, like look at Mexico, they're the number one buyer of US corn. Okay. They're the number three buyer of US wheat. All right. Canada has an extremely aggressive program where they export durum, mostly through their Thunder Bay program to the east through the St. Lawrence Seaway. And I'm sure they do some on the West Coast as well. But either way, it's a market that's very well developed. There's a lot of expertise. And granted, not a lot of US durum goes into Canada. Well, not from Eastern Montana. So I won't speak out of school here. I'm sure plenty of US durum goes into the Canadian program, but just none from here specifically. And they also have the biggest canola program in the world, which is a very popular crop out here in Eastern Montana, especially this year. Just driving around Roosevelt County, you see a lot more canola out there this year than last year. And I'll dig deep into the reasons why that is. But the base reason is wheat just isn't paying the bills this year, and we can kind of we can unpack that a little bit later. But in the meantime, I think I've answered your question.
Yeah. And I think we've actually talked about this particular topic before, but are farmers holding on to their grain longer now because of uncertain markets? What are these uncertain markets doing
Yeah, that's
yeah,
a great question. The answer is yes and no. It depends on what they're growing. So here in Eastern Montana, these farmers have a lot of on-the-farm stores. They have a lot of capacity. Almost all of their uh, extra income is going to building upright space. So when I say upright space, I'm talking about grain bins. Okay. So as opposed to like a bunker pile on the ground or putting them in those big bags. So they're building space, but there have been guys that have also invested in baggers. So because the price of wheat is far below the cost of production right now. So just put some real numbers on it. So right now, if a
yeah,
farmer calls me up and says, "Hey, Jason, I've got 50,000 bushels. I need to sell you. What's the best you can do for me?" Well, right now I'm hovering right above $5. And a lot of these farmers tell me that their cost of production is not too far off from $7 per bushel. And just for context, for anyone listening to this who doesn't understand what a bushel of wheat, a bushel of wheat is 60 pounds of product. So just you can kind of do the math in your head. And even though the rest of the world trades wheats in tons, we're one of the only ones that does it in bushels because, of course, we have to be different, right? So yeah, like I said, we're nearly $2 per bushel below the cost of production when you factor in the cost of machinery, the cost of maintenance, the cost of labor, the cost of inputs like fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, things like this that the farmer uses every single year to keep their crop in condition. And condition is a topic we might come back to later in this conversation because like I said, the United States has a high quality bushel. The only way to keep it that way is to use these modern practices that we use, which require a lot of liquid capital to execute. But anyway, to continue answering your questions here. So the farmer, right now they're really leaning into the rotation because the writing was on the wall last year. The market was very bearish wheat. Guys would call me up and say, "Hey, Jason, what's wheat going to do next year?" I would honestly tell them go down, because I sit around and I look at markets all day long. I understand fundamentals. I understand the futures market quite well, which is the whole reason why farmers even want to talk to me, right? Because this is kind of the soup that I swim in. I sit
Mhm.
around and analyze markets all day long. So, of course, I'm perpetually bearish, have been for the last year. And, unfortunately, I was correct. So here we are, you know, um, last year I was able to buy $7 wheat plus, and right now I think my cash price today is right around 5.15. So what's happening is they're storing their higher value crop on the farm, which right now would be yellow peas, which the price of yellow peas is also taking a big hit too. We'll get into that later if you want.
Mhm.
And yellow peas are normally on a 3-year rotation. Okay, so these guys are kind of disrupting their rotation just to try to make a little bit more money this year. Also, guys, like I said, grew more canola. Canola is kind of hanging in there. I feel like canola is going to do well this year. It's probably going to do a little bit better next year. Canola is worth about $18, $19 per hundredweight right now, which isn't super, but it's great. It's enough to pay the bills. It's above cost of production. So what's going to happen is the farmers are going to take their higher value pulses and oil seeds, like yellow peas, green lentils, red lentils, chickpeas, and then their oil seeds like flax, camelina, canola. They're going to throw those in the bin. Those crops are going to occupy all of their farm space. And then they're going to stuff as much wheat on the farm as they can. And then whatever they can't stuff on the farm, they're going to bring to me. And they're not going to sell it. We have a pretty aggressive delayed pricing program right now, not just my elevator, but pretty much every grain company out here. So for anyone listening to this, so when a farmer delivers their grain to the grain elevator, a lot of times you have what's called a storage program or a DP program. I'll briefly explain these.
Yeah.
When a farmer puts their grain on storage, they're delivering the bushel to the elevator and they're retaining ownership of that bushel. Okay. So that means the elevator can't ship it and they can't sell it. And the interesting thing to note here is the farmer can then take out a warehouse receipt against those bushels to turn those bushels into currency before they've actually priced them. Okay. Because a warehouse receipt is considered legal tender, it's currency. But we don't do that out here in Montana. At least I don't know anyone that issues warehouse receipts. So the more common thing you have farmers doing out here is what's called DP or delayed pricing. So what happens is the farmer delivers the bushel to the elevator, and then the elevator puts the bushel on contract, takes ownership of the bushel, can ship the bushel, can sell the bushel, and up to a certain degree, because we can't just let go of all that risk, because most of this stuff is all about risk management, right? You can't just sell all your DP bushels. So we can ship it within reason. And then what happens is we say, hey, okay, farmer, you have until X day of X month of X year to lock in a price, either a cash price or lock in the basis, either one. And I can explain what those mean later.
Okay.
And you'll pay X amount of cents per bushel per month, prorated per day. And to most guys, that's a good deal because it's cheaper than building a bin, building a 500,000 bushel bin on their farm, right? Because my elevator is pretty large. I, ship out full shuttles. When I load a train of wheat, it's 435,000 bushels per train. So I'm moving large volumes. So as long as my traders can keep me empty, I can continue to take the bushel and keep the farmers moving, which is what they're going to do. Like I said, they're just going to store all their high value crop and they're going to deliver all their low value crop, which this year is wheat, which is the number one cash crop in northeastern Montana. So there you go. There's a very long answer to your question.
So, Jason, what else can you tell us about some of these economic impacts of the tariff?
Sure. Well, specifically here in Richland County in Sydney, my beautiful home where I live, about 2 years ago, we had our sugar beet plant shut down. Right? It made, well, at least it made local news, but I'm sure anyone who's interested in agriculture knows what I'm talking about. So this caused several things to happen, and I'll go in order here. And this what I'm about to say will draw back on something that I mentioned earlier about keep in the back of your head, dear listener, back when I said at the beginning of this conversation that the number one buyer of corn that is produced in the United States is Mexico. So just keep that in your head. So the sugar beet plant shuts down. Okay, big hit to the community. Hundreds of people lose their job. Life goes on. Okay, so these farmers that have been out here for a generation growing sugar beets now have all this equipment, highly specialized equipment, by the way, and all these irrigated acres that they need to figure out something to do with. Okay, and economically, it does not pay to irrigate wheat. Okay, unless you're growing like non-GMO, organic, or like some type of exotic wheat, it simply doesn't pay. Okay, to grow hard wheat like Durham or hard red spring or hard red winter, which are basically the three wheats that we grow out here. Irrigating it, you're losing money. Okay, so right now we have more corn acres this year than we've had in the last couple of years because it pays to irrigate corn. And I don't think I need to tell anyone who's aware of agriculture markets what's happening right now. The corn market is terrible. So I've got the Chicago pulled up right now. I'm looking at it on Friday when we close. The Chicago is showing me $3.83. So our local basis is about 80 cents. So does it pay to irrigate, to even grow and irrigate corn right now? The answer is not really. So these farmers are stuck with this crop that is simply unprofitable. I'm not saying that the price of corn the price of corn that we're seeing right now. It's not being determined 100% by the chaos that's going on at the border with Mexico with the tariffs and with retaliatory tariffs. That's because the Chicago market is traded globally. Anybody, sitting in their basement, in any random country anywhere in the world can buy and sell corn futures, as long as you have a brokerage to go through, right? So it's a little more complicated, but the interesting part of the story, like, is something else I alluded to earlier. Canada and Mexico are coming together and they're trying to figure out an economic path forward that does not include us. So if you think the price of corn is bad now, like if you think my 80 under basis is bad now, later on this year or early next year, I could be $1.50 under the board. So so now what's happened is created a situation where these farmers who for a generation were growing sugar beets and now are growing one of the only other profitable crops that you can irrigate, what are they going to grow now?
They're getting screwed over again.
Yeah, soybeans. I mean, unfortunately, if for anyone who's interested in kind of climate, the climatological feasibility of the stuff like this, like, yeah, we could grow soybeans, and there are people up here that grow soybeans, but it's with heavy investment. These guys have channel irrigation, they have drip irrigation. We simply are not hot enough for most of the, Montana. I'm sure most people that are listening to this that live in Montana knows. We simply don't have the heat to grow a good soybean crop up here. Not, at least not like they do in the Midwest. So yeah, could they plant soybeans under those irrigation pivots? Sure. Is it going to take a long time for the genetics to catch up to where they're actually getting the yield to make it make sense financially? Yeah, we're probably 5 or 6 years away, to getting the soybean genetics to grow this far north, at least reliably without all this tremendous investment in your ground. So yeah, so that's kind of like a hyper local example of how all this stuff has impacted us here in Richland County and Roosevelt County.
Great. Okay. I'm learning a lot here. And my next question is more about the people. And from what I know about folks that work in ag, you got to be an optimistic soul to endure. So my question for you is how are people? I mean, what do you see your friends, neighbors, the folks you're working with? How are they responding to what they're seeing right now? Is this something that's making them pretty nervous, or is this just keeping them on their toes? What are you sensing from people in your part of the state?
Yeah, you're not going to like this answer, but I'm really not noticing anything. And keep in mind, I pretty much only interact with farmers. Like, I've got two young boys. When I'm not at work, that's what I'm doing. So I only talk to farmers. I'm only, they're the only people I interact with. And,
Right.
they're taking it on the chin for now, but like with an emphasis on for now. Like a lot of these guys, farmers are very pragmatic. They're very good at adapting. Um, I've had some interesting conversations. I've had guys sit down at my desk across from me and begin a conversation like, I voted for Trump, but, because they're starting to feel the pressure of the decisions that the current administration is making. And like I said, it's not even really that bad right now because they keep moving the goalposts on what these tariffs are actually going to look like to our north and south. I think they actually have a solid 35% tariff on Canadian goods, but like I said, the Canadians are ready to move forward. They're ready to move past us. Same with the Mexicans, who are historically our greatest trading partner. So yeah, they're taking it with a good sense of humor. They're taking it with, looking forward and just hoping next year is going to be better. The one thing that's going to save these guys out here, and this is a conversation I have a lot, is the diversity of the operations out here. We've got small farmers that farm like 300 to 1,300 acres. We've got medium-sized farmers, that farm, 3 to 7,000 acres, and I've got big farmers that farm 10,000 acres plus. And luckily, the thing all these guys have in common is because we're mostly dryland farming up here, we're very diverse what we can grow. So, like I said, for a generation, we were growing sugar beets. A generation not too long ago, they were growing safflower. There's always a chance that flax could come back into the market, and the land and the equipment up here is capable of producing oil seeds like that simply don't make sense in places like the Midwest, where they're much higher production, much higher yield. So that's really the only thing keeping these guys on course, is that they know that they can adjust their rotation and lean into the rotation if they need to, if an opportunity presents itself in the market next year. But unfortunately, since we're talking about oil seeds and pulses, going back to something I said earlier about risk, farmers always have to manage their risk. And when you're growing crops that you can't hedge, you're taking on a lot of risk on your farm, because I'll just give a great example. Like out here, if we get it like a contract with a certain company to grow canola, what they'll put in that contract is a clause called force majeure. The common terminology for that farmers know is act of God. So that basically means if there's a crop failure, if there's a hailstorm, if the grasshoppers come and eat up your whole crop, you can walk away from the contract and you're not responsible for it. But companies I feel like over the years have kind of gotten cold on offering force majeure to these non-hedgeable crops. So in the meantime, while hedgeable grains are becoming less and less financially feasible, the non-hedgeable oil seeds and pulses, which on a typical year would get a good price, the end users are simply willing to take less and less risk, and they're basically putting it all off on the farmer by not offering them act of God. So these guys have to be very careful the deals they get into, going into the future, as far as what they're going to grow and what their farm plan is going to be.
Right. So if I'm understanding correctly, then this uncertainty that a lot of farmers are seeing right now, this isn't a deal breaker for them in Trump right now. They're relying on their adaptability and just how they've worked in the past to kind of work around inconveniences. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, at least the ones that can stay in business. The ones where it might be a deal breaker are the ones that are gonna have to sell their land. And there
Right.
will be some out here. I'm telling you right now, there's going to be fewer farmers 2 years from now than there are this harvest. I can basically guarantee that. So those guys, yeah, he'll lose those guys, but the guys that are able to hold on will stick with it.
Okay. So what does something like this mean for small towns around where you live? And are you seeing ripple effects on local business, schools, and services, or that's still not really an issue right now?
Yeah, I mean it's direct. Here in Richland County, we don't have a Walmart, right? These farmers have employees, and almost all the farmers that raise grain out here are also cattlemen. You need people to do that. You need staff. And the guys that can't stay in business aren't going to be able to keep their people employed. Like I said, case in point with Sydney Sugars. When they shut down, I think they lost 200 or 300 full-time employees, and probably double that amount seasonal. employees. So, I mean, it has a direct impact on what we're doing out here because we don't have a lot of the niceties. Like, for example, in North Dakota, they have a state mill. We don't have one of those here in Montana. Like we have all this cattle, but we don't have like we don't have a meat processing co-op. We don't have a tannery. And as a matter of fact, we don't have a co-op at all. The closest co-op to here is Horizon Resources over in Williston, in North Dakota. So we don't really have a lot of safety nets to keep agriculture relevant here if these farmers start going out of business. Like I said, if we had a state mill or we had a state tannery or if we had a state slaughterhouse or meatpacking house, something that could at least get us through the times like this with a great deal of uncertainty. But we simply don't have that. And not to mention all the truck drivers. Like I said, cattle, when
Yeah,
cattle need to go to the feedlot, you don't drive them there. They get, drive like cattle drive. You have to put them on a truck and a truck driver takes them there. Same thing with the
right.
farmers. Like my big guys that farm 20, 30,000 acres, they hire, trucks, half a dozen trucks, a dozen trucks. So I mean, those are the best kind of jobs to have out here because these farmers are hauling grain all year round. So we're hauling during harvest and in the wintertime, December, January, February, March, we're going to be busy with trucks. And if the grain's not there, then those jobs aren't there.
Here's a question for you. Do you see any parallels to other difficult times in farming history to the moment, I guess, farmers in northeastern Montana are experiencing now?
Yeah, I mean, I have. I mean, we've been through worse. I'll say that. We've been through worse, but it's still, we've got a long ways to go. Like, for example, back in 2019, we're having big storms up here in the high plains, and there's huge quality issues. They're just getting rained on and rained on and rained on, like during harvest. And all of the wheat was very low quality. It had a fungal infection called ergot, which I'm sure most people have heard of. It's extremely virulent in hard wheats, and it basically makes the wheat worthless. You can't even feed it, as a matter of fact, because if you feed ergot, the cattle will get poisoned and their hooves will fall off and they'll start to die. So, and we had like sprout issues. Yeah, we just had such low quality that we couldn't ship the crop. So yeah, I mean we've seen hard times before up here in the high plains. It's really, it's not as bad as it could be, but like I said, we've got a long way to go.
Yeah, that leads me to my last question. So what worries you the most about the future if these tariffs continue, and what brings you hope?
Yeah, what worries me is kind of like something I alluded to earlier, like just being left out of the conversation in the North American agricultural trade. Because Mexico agriculture is big, Canada agriculture is big. Just to really put a fine point on this. So, like I said, Regina, which is a big city in Canada, in Saskatchewan, just north of us here, not very far away, three of the major grain companies in the world are building canola crush plants there. One of them should be online this year, and the other two should be online within the next 1 or 2 years. So, once again, the power of the farmer out here is their diversity. So if we can't count on Canada having their gates open to take our canola, let's just say 2 years in the future, they made up their mind they've had enough. They don't want to take any US deliveries. We're just completely cut out of this market. The Canadians move a lot of canola all over the world. As a matter of fact, if you want to hedge canola, the rapeseed exchange is Canadian. Just to really punctuate, how important they are to that market. And if we're left here as a non-participant, if these farmers out here don't even have that as an option, that's a huge blow to these guys out here. It's just one less thing that they can grow profitably if it comes to that. But like I said, this is a speculative problem in the future, but this is something I see happening and that I do worry about. And going south of the border, once again, corn. These irrigated acres that we have out here, I don't really think we have anything else that makes sense to grow besides corn. And if the Mexicans aren't buying our corn, that's not going to look good. Like I said, the basis is just going to get wider and wider and wider every year. And it's just, those acres, they're either going to go fallow or they're just going to sell them.
I do have a follow up on that. What can our congressional delegation be doing right now to support farmers, and what can just regular Montanans that aren't working in ag do to be supportive during this time?
Well, that's a complicated question to answer. But certainly initiatives at the federal level that make it easier to form co-ops and make it easier for grain companies, especially small grain companies like the one that I work for, uh, to come in and do business in these rural areas. Tax incentives is a good place to start. Make it easier to hire people out here, make it easier to operate year round, things like that. I mean, there are ground level things that our congressional delegation could do. Like, for example, like if there was money to offer a grant or a low interest loan, if some farmers wanted to come together and make a co-op and say, make a little meat packing operation or make a little tannery or something like that, just small scale, because that's all we need out here. There's not that many people in Montana and not that many people in eastern Montana. We don't need anything huge. We're not asking to come in and build a 7 million bushel elevator, but something small, at least have a program or have a grant or have a loan available through the USDA or through FSA, to be able to help these guys out here if they want to make that decision. Oh, and by the way, cutting funding for the FSA is not helping anyone either. So, and also the university extension offices too. And that's another thing I'll bring up. So the extension office, we have an extension office right here in Sydney, Montana, okay? And they just recently had to let go several of their research scientists. Well, guess what? We depend on that for our genetics. We're not in the Midwest, those farmers, they can, they're growing 300 bushel corn out there. They can afford to buy the fanciest, most cutting edge genetics, to for their seed to put in the ground. We depend on the research being done by the extension offices out here to keep our genetic diversity, up to task for the changing climatological conditions out here. So with cutting funding to these organizations certainly is not helping us. So that, to answer your question, that's another thing they could do. Hey, how about let us hire some more scientists to work at the extension office so our genetics don't fall behind, so we can continue to plant resistant and resilient crops out here.
That makes sense. That's something that folks like me would have not even thought of, but they're losing jobs up there as well with research.
Oh, yeah.
Jason, thanks again for taking time away from your busy harvest season to chat with us. We're super grateful for your time.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Please come to me anytime. I'm happy to answer any questions related to agriculture.